Good afternoon. Oh, it's quite loud. I'll try that again. Good afternoon. Welcome to the 2018 Bannon Memorial Lecture. For those of you who are students on this campus, you will recognize the name Bannon from buildings, but also from the Ignatian Center's Bannon Institutes. Father Lou Bannon was a long-term faculty member here. He was also a member of the Jesuit community here at Santa Clara. He and his family endowed many things here. The Bannon Family Endowment is dedicated to promoting the Catholic Jesuit character of a Santa Clara education. And that is the core mission of the Ignatian Center for Jesuit Education. In the year 2014, the Ignatian Center established the annual Bannon Memorial Lecture, which was founded to bring a member of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, to campus each year. Somebody who would reflect on contemporary, pressing, religious, social, and cultural concerns in the light of our Ignatian heritage. Since that time, this series has been very carefully curated by the current director of the Ignatian Center's Bannon Institutes, Dr. Teresa Ladrigal-Welpley, who is here with us in the front row. Sadly, this lecture also represents the last Bannon Memorial Lecture that she will curate, as Teresa will be leaving the Ignatian Center and the campus at the end of this quarter for a new post as Vice President for Mission Integration at Salve Regina University, Newport, Rhode Island. So this is an important opportunity for me to thank her for all she has done through the work of the Bannon Institutes that she has so carefully and diligently and I think imaginatively curated. So thank you very much, Teresa, and welcome.
Thank you, Father Dorian, for that very generous introduction. And let me just say it's been such a privilege for me to serve this university and this community over my time here, with all of you in partnership advancing the mission, the vocation of this community, which I hope is to build a more just, sustainable, humane world. So it's just been a privilege through these 12 years, and I will carry this community forward, as I know so many of you in graduating do as well. So I hope that today's Bannon Memorial Lecture will continue to further our university's mission by calling us to reflect and contemplate the common good in our common home, from California to the Philippines, so that we can respond ever more faithfully to this summons to solidarity. Cardinal Peter Turkson, head of the new Vatican Dicastery for the Promotion of Integral Human Development, visited Santa Clara University 2 years ago for a conference engaging Silicon Valley with the environmental teachings of Pope Francis. During this visit, Cardinal Turkson reflected on the ways in which environmental harm compromises commitments central to Catholic social teaching, commitments to the common good, commitments to human life and human dignity, especially the poor and most vulnerable. Human-forced climate change and environmental degradation is unequivocally a moral issue. As Cardinal Turkson reflected during his visit, the word common brings to mind the tragedy of the commons, a circumstance where the self-interested actions of one or more agents deplete a common resource. In his encyclical Laudato Si, Pope Francis declares the climate and the atmosphere to be common goods, belonging to all and meant for all. The oceans and other natural resources should likewise be considered as a global commons, protected by an appropriate system of governance. And yet, questions of environmental justice, climate justice, and the common good have been markedly absent of late and of past in our public discourse and action. Locally, though California recently signed into law 2 historic bills related to climate and environmental justice, An equity assessment from researchers at 4 California universities documented a rise in greenhouse gases and co-pollutants locally, disproportionately impacting low-income communities and communities of color. Pursuing environmental justice in 2018 requires all of us to awaken to the reality that those with the least amount of access to power, to privilege, and to wealth often bear a disproportionate share of the negative environmental consequences resulting from industrial, governmental, and commercial operations or policies. Recent issues in Flint, Standing Rock, Texas, Puerto Rico have all highlighted this reality in distressing and particularly visible ways. So if we're to respond to Pope Francis's urging to integrate questions of justice and reconciliation in debates on the environment, so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, we need to orient our dialogue, our reflection, and our directed action more fully into the commons. We're grateful today to attend to this urgent work with Father Pedro Walpole of the Society of Jesus. Father Walpole works in sustainable environment and community land management in Southeast Asia, with local communities, universities, international organizations, and governments. He's the coordinator of Eco-Jesuit, a global ecology network of Jesuits and partners from around the world, moving an ecological agenda and exploring collaboration. He's also the director of research for the Environmental Science for Social Change, a Jesuit research and training institute in the Philippines that promotes environmental sustainability and social justice through the integration of scientific methodologies and social processes. His doctorate is in land use change from King's College, London, and he teaches courses on integrating human development and natural resource management for graduate students of the UN-mandated University for Peace and the Ateneo de Manila University. Father Walpole also directs the Apu Palaguan Cultural Education Center that operates an upland basic education program and technical training for indigenous children in northern Mindanao, with a cultural-based curriculum and multi-language education. He continues to live with the Pulangian, an upland indigenous community in Mindanao in the Philippines. Following Father Walpole's memorial lecture, we will hear a brief response from 2 of our colleagues here at Santa Clara, and then have time for our own dialogue together. Our first respondent will be Father Thomas Massaro of the Society of Jesus. Father Massaro is professor of moral theology at the Jesuit School of Theology of Santa Clara and the former dean of the school. He's the author of multiple books and articles, including one to be released next month entitled Mercy in Action, The Social Teachings of Pope Francis, and a classic now in its 3rd edition entitled Living Justice, Catholic Social Teaching and Action. Our second respondent will be Dr. Christopher Bacon. Dr. Bacon is Associate Professor in the Department of Environmental Studies and Sciences here at Santa Clara and Bannon Faculty Fellow in the Ignatian Center. He specializes in sustainable livelihoods and food security in Central America and environmental justice in California. His work often takes a community-based participatory action research approach to generate knowledge that informs both theory and social change. He chairs our Bannon Institute Faculty Collaborative on Environmental Justice and the Common Good. So we'll hear brief responses from Father Massaro and Dr. Bacon a little later in the program. But to begin, please join me in welcoming Father Pedro Walpole for our 2018 Bannon Memorial Lecture, Not a Roadmap, but a Trail, Environmental Justice in the Commons. Father Walpole.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your welcome. I think you will notice here there is something old and there is something new. Maybe it's from past association, but I'm afraid I still speak of the University of Santa Clara. It should be Santa Clara University. Something new is a slight shift in the title. I want to talk a little about environmental reconciliation and explain to you how that is understood to encompass both justice and solidarity. I begin in terms of the whole world needing to network new paths towards sustainability, social inclusion, and climate. We don't have roadmaps yet. I feel this is one of the paths we're going down today that hopefully will lead to a clearer and a straighter way forward. Ecology and economy share the same world origin. Let me just put this on here. The same word origin, oikos, and can be supportive of the whole of humanity and our common home when balanced. But ecology and economy are becoming mutually exclusive. The commons is increasingly in the hands of corporate extraction and pollution. Justice and sustainability have never been so challenged. Boldly stated, this is the challenge. It is also the hope that we face globally. The toll gate of technological intervention, my understanding of technocracy, too often restricts the basic access of the most vulnerable to many forms of sustainability. Licensed exploitation for economic growth exhausts the land and the waters, often obliterating basic local rights and services. Economic growth is the primary value, while profit is held by the few. Media holds the imagination of many, and using novelty as the perpetual lure drives increased consumption. The struggle is within, the struggle is without, and ultimately the struggle is together. The path begins with every person, with every community. We change from within and discover anew what we value and are willing to commit to in solidarity and in reconciliation. From the unique local culture and circumstances, the world needs to share and to network new routes to sustainability, local inclusion, and climate. The challenge is to remake the global model involving the participation of all in a full cycle production. We are not going to see the present economic model simply flip over. The struggle to create new practices of sustainability, full cycle and with integrity, are curbing the status quo, but are inadequate as focused efforts to make changes are constantly compromised. The challenge is, how can we act as a transformative force? This includes campuses, professional and volunteer organizations, local communities, states and countries. Those with a vision and those with needs must meet. A case I remember very much, even from the Philippine context, was discussed, Flint City, and we discussed it or mentioned it in some classes over the last 2 days. So, an overview of what I'm going to talk about. Networking of new paths is basically what I've gone through. I want to look at the context of dominant economic development model. And then I want to start to look at where starting points might be for all of us in terms of gratitude and community. Because if we look at the world today, we cannot take it on directly. I want to look at meaning and depth of reconciliation and discernment, because there are new moves in the Jesuit process and universal apostolic priorities. I want to look at working practices in terms of what Eco-Jesuit, which is partly what I'm engaged in, and also efforts in the circular economy, of which you may know more than I do. I then want to finally look at what we call Generation 2030 and where paths may meet. So please, as a footnote, I say, realize that I am not saying anything today as an expert. It has come through listening, learning, and engagement, through growing involvement, and from geographic and cultural strengths that I find. If you find any answers in what I am saying, they are really your answers, your discovery. So let me turn to the context. The context is today's economic development model. This model builds individual-based, common global attitudes and aspirations, having limited transparency and accountability. This highway of economic development dominates the social infrastructure for at least the near future, bulldozing and building over much that is integral, sustainable, and communal. I understand that several corporations are now actually buying out the aquifers of the Amazon. This is unbelievable. Even the World Economic Forum report for this year identifies the urgency of facing up to systemic challenges that have intensified over the past years amid proliferating signs of uncertainty, instability, and fragility. I'm not expecting you to be able to read this, but color coding is helpful. When this report started in 2008, it was dominated by economic risks, noted by the blue, as it spoke of acid price collapse, slowing Chinese economy, oil and gas spikes, chronic imbalances, unemployment, and income disparity. This is the interconnecting web of related problems. In measuring the trends and risks in terms of global likelihood and impact, in 2018, it shows perhaps a surprising message. There is not one blue element up there. If we look at the risks, we see the likelihood of risks, we see extreme weather events, natural disaster, we see technological risks in terms of cyber attacks and data fraud, and we see, again, failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation. If we look to, if something were to happen, the impact of that, we see weapons of mass destruction certainly come in on the geopolitical level. But then we go back to extreme weather events, natural disasters, failure of climate change. And a new one, which has moved into the social category because of its consequence, water crisis. We can think of Cape Town as having a zero date in April. Whether that changes with the new government is another question. So the risks from an economic stand complement the warnings we have from the scientific. The 9 planetary boundaries are all interconnected through ecosystem flows as well as the economic flows and climate in our own geographic landscape, which is where I've put them on here. And it's really the first 4 of those economic planetary boundaries that are driving to affect the other. These two areas of economic risk and planetary boundaries in turn directly interconnect with social vulnerability. Much of the global population has to overcome this in developing resilience. Commitment to social upliftment and development challenges all countries to seek a better world locally and universally with the Sustainable Development Goals. There is still a need to bridge the gap of social inequalities, but also the dead-end production system that is 90% waste-prone. That's what's come out in the recent report of this effort of circular economy. I think we've lost the top of that there, but I think it's evident. We're reminded, and we need to remind ourselves all the time, and Pope Francis does so in Laudato Si', that there are many good works by social organizations and human development programs. Yet the game plan globally has changed, and these good works are not adequately mainstreamed or connected with the educational culture of getting ahead, consumer choices, and communication and the social media. If I shift a little to Asia at the moment, in Asia, economic development is the focus of every country. Many attend business schools, even throughout the US, and I watch them return with an understanding of ethics that is merely legal, and a new ethics of sustainability which is marginal. Developing countries are importing the model of growth at all costs. Likewise, many people subscribe to an attitude of brash political leadership statements, but not to the underlying implications. In seeking socio-political advance, the concept of harmony is used, which does not necessarily include human rights or democracy as fundamental. The rights of the individual must yield to national progress. Value systems, religious and cultural practices can simply be walled up as private matters, and only the only sense of value expressed is reduced to the dollar. Even in Asia, we still talk of the dollar. The common good is no longer common. Pankaj Mishra quotes Zhang Jumai a century ago, who spoke that an agrarian country has few material demands and can exist over a long period of time with poverty but equality, scarcity but peace. Returning to the austere age of wisely managed expectations is no longer possible, even if desirable. But there is no doubt that many more people across a wide swath of the world will awaken with rage against what Zhang has called a condition of prosperity without equality, wealth without peace. All of the above are tough words at a time when the common good is marginal and rage is mounting in a rough world. Oftentimes, these words are too tough for us to act on, and we feel compromised and diminished and may withdraw. Yet we must not be overtaken by the rage or by the withdrawal. The economic, scientific, and social analysis spoken of above, along with the reflections of Laudato Si' and integral ecology, and our own social commitment can lead us in finding new ways. In order for this reconciliation to occur, several things are needed beyond mere recognition of the problem and my own inadequacies to change anything. So, in a Jesuit sense, we have been looking out upon the world, and we are now challenged to go deeper, and we must go deeper within. Many of the classes I have been with during the last few days, I've been asked, what do we need to look out for? How do we prepare? And I think the one word that has come up several times has been the need for care. Care for neighbor, care for creation, and care for self. We sometimes too easily undermine what we do. So in grappling with this view of the world, there is a need to go deeper into our own meaning of life, commitment, and choices. Do I have moments in my daily life when I can step back from all the social connectivity and academic research and listen to my needs, my wants, my aspirations and challenges, so as to reach a level of balance and of meaning? This is something of a Jesuit examine. But do I have that freedom? So that I am not hounded and I can actually find my own balance? Can I reach a peaceful level of understanding in my life right now as to where I am, in balance with what I have and with what I want to be? Am I comfortable with who I am and all my limitations? Am I able to say, for where I am now, I have enough? Do I have a sense of enoughness? Or is there always more and more that I seek? At what point does enoughness become sustainable? At what point does this sense of sustainability turn into a sense of abundance? These are not easy questions. They are not always answerable. Students can face unreasonable demands and carry many responsibilities, but the need to balance is the greatest skill in moving forward with hope. The outcome, despite all the uncertainties, can be a sense of gratitude if we have this time and place to reflect. Gratitude for life and for how I choose to live. This can be one of the most personally transforming experiences. As such, change is not based on power gained, but acceptance and vision. Let me move to this process as it goes through community in building relationships with commitment. In the coming decade, a growing challenge will be, how do I want to live with others? Okay, I focus on my profession and my development in a career, and I will probably have periods of unemployment, and that will be more than a challenge, which should help me question, however, where I get my strength and my meaning from, and should challenge my expectations. We may increasingly need to seek out communities of practice or of justice, of sharing values where there is an ethics of enoughness. I will have to actively work for this sense of community, given today's self-sufficiency and where there is much isolation and not knowing others. I was very interested in the legal discussion yesterday that I was in terms of condominiums, and how is, on my side of that, and Manila life, how is a condominium to be made into a community? Community is not a social given anymore. The common good and intergenerational solidarity are best nurtured through communities of practice. Such communities of practice act in ways that, one, share values and principles that a group work with. It can be an organic farming, urban organic farming group. It can be a virtual network of people sharing ideas for community action. A community of action, a community of justice, invites others to share. It calls for deeper listening and response. It addresses vulnerabilities and youth insecurities. Communities of action and of justice are occasions for seeking peace within and around, of being occasions for freedom from fear. Such communities can heal the landscape and seek greater sustainability in all their actions. This transformation that starts with self and enters community life, it starts with developing an interiority where values emerge. So this interiority helps us, it's where, in a sense, it connects with a solidarity and weaves a process of deepening through reflection, of mind shift and of hope, and can result in a transformation of person and how I see society with all its problems. Let me take a little time still to talk about the meaning and the depth of reconciliation today as it's being discussed in some circles, and of discernment. Let me turn to the General Congregation 36 of the Society of Jesus, where Jesuits got together, it's over a year ago now, to understand basically how we can reflect on justice and how it is deepened when placed in the broader mission of reconciliation. I quote the letter of Father General Adolfo Nicolas on reconciliation, and the teachings of Pope Francis have given a deeper vision of God working in the world. This greater depth, placing of faith, justice, and solidarity with the poor and the excluded is a central element of the mission of reconciliation. So this is the first time I've seen faith, justice, and solidarity put within the mission of reconciliation. Furthermore, the three dimensions of this ministry of reconciliation, namely reconciliation with God, with one another, and with creation, assumes a new urgency. The reconciliation is always a work of justice, a justice discerned and enacted in local communities and contexts. The cross of Christ and our sharing in it are also at the center of God's work of reconciliation. I continue to quote, "We draw profit," Pope Francis indicated, "from holding these tensions together. contemplation and action, faith and justice, charism and institutions, community and mission. We too desire to contribute to that which today seems impossible, as I'm quoting from the letter of Father de Sosa. So we have outlined the impossible. And yet, we desire, he says, to contribute to that which today seems impossible, a humanity reconciled in justice that lives in peace, in a common home well cared for, where there is a place for all, because we recognize each other as brothers and sisters, sons and daughters of the same and only Father. This, for me, does two things. First, it places justice clearly within the Jesuit mission of reconciliation. And second, it gives me the courage not to give up. We can face the impossible not from a position of needing greater power or even strength, but from a position of humble faith, hope, and mercy. In this context, environment and reconciliation is relationship, is solidarity. Environment is personal action. Communities of practice and networking for transformation. The environment is not just something out there. I understand Laudato Si, as Pope Francis speaks of it, as everything that comes out from me, everything that comes out from you, and everything that we are connected with. Environment is relationship. It's not environment as relationship that we happen to look at it, but environment is the very air I breathe and everything that I say and act. And this is where we need to connect. So let me continue by way of a further digression into Jesuit responsibilities and the spirituality of decision-making and the process. The Ignatian Center for Jesuit Education here, Sustainable Campus Management, Centers for Sustainability, the Faculty Collaborative that I've met, the Miller Center for Social Enterprise, so many of the institutions and practices here are a care for our common home. There is a focus on community involvement, fair trade, science for problem solving. These all reflect the faculty's commitment and understanding of Catholic social teaching. The question might be, how can this engagement be strengthened by the ongoing discernment of the universal apostolic preferences of the Jesuits? The Jesuit discernment in common, and I quote from recent letters of Father Sosa, if I'm correct, takes place in both our communities and our apostolic works. The Jesuits need everyone who is involved in the apostolic works and the education that's here to be actively participating as partners in mission. It makes sense that the particular group which discerns in common should vary with the decisions that need to be made. Father Sosa is saying in his letter, the positive tension between discernment in common and apostolic planning requires, according to the Ignatian vision, a spiritual examen, of which I have talked of earlier, of what we have experienced, so that we continually grow in fidelity. Therefore, a systematic evaluation of our apostolates is not sufficient. We must supplement that systematic evaluation with a spiritual perspective of the examen, a practice by which Ignatius invites us to recognize the action of God in history. It is possible, he says, and necessary for all those who share in the mission, but not necessarily our Christian faith, to acquire the interior freedom which enables them to divest themselves of self-love, self-will, and self-interests. This interior freedom is the human possibility to grow as persons in gratuitous relationship with others, seeking the greater good of all, even when such a pursuit involves, as a consequence, personal renunciation and sacrifice. Thus, apostolic planning, he says, is born of discernment in common and becomes an instrument of our apostolic effectiveness, and we avoid the dangers of a trendy type of planning that makes use only of techniques of corporate development. For me, this whole dynamic of examine and discernment is about keeping all things in balance, including what I spoke of earlier, and my own sense of belonging, the sense of communities I live with, the science and the policies I work with. So, this is why justice in the commons is but a trail. Every institute has to negotiate with greater participation the path forward in this discernment of priorities and the extra efforts needed to get both in-house participation and equity of voices to contribute much more broadly than the Institute's sustainability, but that of the whole of society, so the whole of your community here in California. We have a journey that must begin with every community and every village. The path is not laid out, so it must be worked out through our attitudes and commitments. Some of those attitudes and commitments I'm going to share with you in terms of what Jesuit, which is the global social apostolate for the environment, is putting forward. We have 5 areas, and we've talked about this in a number of discussions I've been with. I will go through them very rapidly. But disaster risk reduction and water. Energy and fossil fuels, organic farming and land use, lifestyle initiatives using SDGs from local to global, education and sustainability. So disaster risk reduction is the first response, because whether you understand the climate is changing or not, and I don't want to debate that in this country, there are people who are suffering, and we have to break this cycle of repeated disaster and lack of resilience, and we have to move into a sustainability. COP23, which was the follow-on from the Paris Agreement that was held in Germany, was actually held for developing island states, and that's what the bottom logo is about there, and how we can engage there. And there are Jesuits working in these areas. The second is energy. I'm hearing that something might be brewing in Seattle over divestment. We're dealing with Adani coal mines in Australia and the nuclear problems throughout the world. There's no place anymore for the nuclear waste. I've heard a lot about organic farming on campus, in the communities, networking from Nicaragua throughout the world that you're connected with here. And that's the local response to land use, which is a major driver. Some of you may know of REPAM, which is the network, the ecclesial, the bishops' network for the Amazonia. There's one that has emerged from REBAC for the Congo, And I'm looking to see if we can start one in Asia Pacific. So join us in that. We may be familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, and I know the Institute here is connecting them to all of their work. They're a great benchmark and basis of accountability and basis for talking with governments in countries that otherwise won't talk with us because they've signed off on them. And so we can show what's happening in communities in relation to this. There's the Jesuit Worldwide Network as well that's there of linking thousands of basic education institutions. Last, I just want to show such efforts as Healing Earth, Flights for Forests, Ignition Carbon Challenge. I think some of the activities that are going on within your own universities, within the US, could be linked. My effort has been to try to track what happened with Living in a Broken World in 1999, Healing a Broken World, which led to Loyola Chicago's initiatives, all of these conferences. But then there are conferences that are happening in other parts of the world, and the need to link these, and the importance of linking with ECHO Jesuit on the one hand, but also IAJU, the International Association of Jesuit Universities globally, which is meeting in Bilbao this July, and hopefully we can move forward. Let me take a few more minutes here. This brings us back in with a certain hope and participation to where I started. And we need to get this oikos, this ecology and economic balance working together, a circular economy. So I'll have 9 brief points here. Given that the blueprint for national economic development for the developing world is defined by open markets, exploitation of resources and of workforces, consumption as one of the primary national values today, this all reflects basically the GDP mentality. 2, there are limitations to the green economy, which I have been working with in part in different countries. The concept that focuses on carbon is very much needed, very important, but there also are some further developments that we need to connect to on the waste side of the equation. Linking GDP and valuation of natural resources does not necessarily shift the fundamentals of extraction and material waste, industrial agriculture, but does give us a link. There's also the gross ecosystem production that some of you may be connecting with as a concept that is helpful. We need all of these trails, as it were, to come together. So how do we effectively question the economic model that drives the world today? So that as things shift, the poor do not again take the brunt and the burden of change. Linking natural capital with SDGs as part of the social development strengthens the awareness. Empowerment from below is critical for change, and I notice in many of the programs here that partnership really needs to be shared. The understanding of it and the processes, the pedagogy of it, need to be shared much more widely. Environmental full cost accounting calls for a systematic response. It works with financial institutions, businesses, governments, and cities to make shifts to a circular economy. In reality, the gap in the circular economy is around 90%, meaning that less than 10% of economic material is returning to the environment in a recyclable manner. This particularly brings to point some of the discussions we've heard earlier today about technological waste in Silicon Valley and how we need to transform that process. We all know that our cell phones are connected to the disaster of the Congo mining and what's happening there for both children on the local level, but also communities and whole countries are caught in the critical minerals that are needed. The challenge of problem-solving science and technology must kick in to radically improve, in a geometric way, material saving. There is a group that's called Circle Economy, Social Enterprise, that believes we do not have to compromise in order to achieve economic, social, and environmental prosperity. Yet society must face the compromises consumers and elite must make in order to make this shift. We cannot make the shift unless consumption makes compromises and the elite. The idea is that academic and NGOs convene and with an authoritative annual report. So how we make this shift, and part of it, and my last point here, is what is the generation 2030? Where are you going to be? Where do you think you're going to be in 2030? As students, as practitioners, as members of community. 2030 is a dynamic that's tied to the Sustainable Development Goals, but it can have much broader appeal and recognition. So the effort is to share a decision process where people can choose to act and be the basis for broader networking of the SDGs, and where this generation wants to impact. So I think, though many of you are connecting in the work, in the studies you're doing to SDGs, we need to connect much more lifelong wise to these challenges. And this raises the final question of the need for, first, much broader collaboration amongst universities today, and your contribution to being community in the future for your students. And the universities need to be institutions of continuous learning, not simply by offering further night classes, but by being involved in communities and the state and more broadly. Involvement in ways that their relationship is not established through students, but by the institution as known for participating in broader community and state concerns, so that knowledge contributes to how community lives, creating more collective responsibility. This can be a presence to past students contributing to their identity and ongoing sense of belonging in community and supporting actions in society. So, thank you.
It's been an honor. This is my first opportunity ever to meet Father Pedro Walpole. As far as I know, we've never been on the same continent together before. People are sometimes surprised that not every Jesuit in the world knows every other Jesuit, even the ones sporting beards. There are 20,000 of us. It's been a pleasure. Just 8 days ago on this campus, my friend Father Mike Eng delivered the State of the University address, and he said something early in his talk that struck me as worth holding on to. He used that phrase, "We do well when we are holding in awe two things: the burdens that our neighbors are carrying. Just think of the people in Parkland, Florida, that high school community holding burdens. But also holding in awe the accomplishments, the contributions that some of our colleagues make. And that came back to me as I heard Father Walpole's address. His work in land management, his work with the Eco-Jesuit Network are well known. His reputation precedes him. And so, again, it's an honor to know him and to see a good slice of his work just now. And it's very easy to be appreciative of the many insights that he brought to us. And let me just talk about a few for 2 or 3 minutes. One accomplishment that he did very well for me, and perhaps the best presentation I've ever heard of accomplishing this, somehow combining the usual environmental concerns, a statement of ecological crisis, with that distinctive Ignatian spirituality that we Jesuits don't always succeed in bringing to our work. There's, in Ignatian spirituality, there's a generosity or a boldness of spirit that we just heard a very fine dose of. Hopefully all Jesuits and our colleagues who experience the spiritual exercises are able to bring the Ignatian contemplative gaze, seeing God and finding God in all things, to our work. And hopefully that leads us to leave the world a little better than it was when we got there. And I certainly see that in the work of Father Walpole and other Jesuits who work so efficaciously in environmental ministries. He reminds us of many of the core values, and some of them are very well summarized by those Sustainable Development Goals for 2030 that he finished on that very strong note. So important to his work and to the work of ecologists around the world is to honor our relationship with the land, so often overlooked here in the global north. We've conquered the land, certainly in Silicon Valley and many parts of the United States, and we're just not cognizant of our relationship, our deep spiritual relationship with the land. Father Walpole is not afraid to face head-on the reality of suffering, and that's both human suffering and the suffering of our fellow creatures, animals and plants and entire ecosystems. That's a really important aspect of any of this work. And he's not afraid to criticize unsustainable models of economic development. Yes, that model of GDP growth, no matter what, needs to be challenged, and he's done it, and many others have as well. I so admire the way that he follows data, much of it presented in an excellent PowerPoint, following the data to its logical conclusion, following the facts wherever they lead, even when inconvenient, not sugarcoating the truth. So we all know that Pope Francis is another Jesuit, even higher profile, who's done this in his career and especially in his advocacy for eco-justice in the last few years since the 2015 publication of Laudato Si. He's been bold in, again, following the facts to their logical conclusion and launching a bold call for integral ecology, which matches other Catholic themes of recent years, recent popes, recent Catholic social teachings of integral development and integral humanism. The summary there is a phrase that Francis used at least a dozen times in Laudato Si. Everything is connected. Connected are the good things that happen and the bad things that happen, the crises that are at once ecological, moral, and anthropological. We're not understanding who we are, what we need to do, and the ecological context in which we do it. So there's an urgency. I like the fact that Pope Francis in his encyclical was able to rouse up some prophetic denunciation. There's a good place for that. Calling out those who are callous, those who practice wasteful practices, and those interests that don't pay attention to the needs of the land, and the resource extraction is a great example of that. But Laudato Si and also the tenor that Father Walpole just gave us are not primarily scolding in nature. There's an invitation. It's a conversation starter, not a conversation stopper. inviting people into a constructive dialogue. One point I'd underline is the rights of indigenous peoples. Pope Francis has been speaking more and more boldly and frequently about that topic, and as a sometime Vatican observer myself, I would not be surprised to see a major papal document coming out about protecting the rights and well-being of indigenous peoples. Maybe a synod, maybe an encyclical, we shall see before too long. Really caring about indigenous people and their way of life, caring enough not to deplete the soil they depend upon, the resources, the conditions that support their distinctive and valuable ways of life. So by way of summary, here's just 3 final points of overlap that I see Father Walpole and certainly our Pope Francis bringing out very clearly. First, a call for balance, a call perhaps for a reset of how we do things. It cannot be business as usual, status quo going forward. Secondly, a call for an internal conversion that matches the social external transformation that we need to see. So in paragraph 217 of Laudato Si', Pope Francis, quoting his predecessor, Benedict XVI, says that the external deserts are growing because the internal deserts in our souls are so vast. We need to listen to that voice. And third and finally, you couldn't miss it, the motif of reconciliation, how important that is. It's part of the priestly vocation that Francis and Pedro and I share. It's part of the Jesuit vocation of wanting to bring about the full shalom, that peaceful order that God calls us to from the earliest parts of the Bible, a call to reconciliation, to bring people together, whether it's through sacramental reconciliation, but also a very practical reconciliation of people with the world. I'd like to turn the microphone over to my colleague, Dr. Christopher Bacon.
The best education is that which teaches us that the end of knowledge is service. And this service is another name for love and fellowship, which constitute the very essence of personal and social life. And love and fellowship bring with them the peacefulness, the gentleness, and humility, basic values of life. And these are some timeless reminders that were spoken by one of the greatest spiritual teachers of the 20th century, Kirpal Singh, who's visited Santa Clara University on a number of occasions over the previous century. And they also resonate with the clarion call that Pedro Walpole was asking us in terms of finding ourselves and cultivating community and an integral ecology, and how we care for our community, how we care for each other, and how we care for the own interiority inside of ourselves. And matching that with a careful look at the evidence, the data, and the patterns of injustice, not closing our blind eye and skipping justice for a thin or shallow reconciliation. I've been honored to be part of the Bannon Institute for Environmental Justice and the Common Good and learn a lot from my colleagues there, including Ira Stewart-Fry, Professor Siming Yang, Chad Raphael, Ed Maurer, and Jasmine Llamas. And it's been a terrific process. And through that time, we have shared many approaches to environmental justice and the common good. And one thing I would like to start with that perhaps complements this is that there is a pretty robust understanding in some communities, particularly in the United States and globally around, what do we mean by environmental justice? Because it's come out of a social movement demand for communities, low-income communities and communities of color that are often disproportionately affected by air pollution. It's come out of social movement engagement with systematic public health, environmental, critical social science. And it's also emerging into a dynamic space for public policy change, which makes it just a fascinating nexus as a scholar to engage with. So what are some definitions? Well, it's a right of all people to a healthy, livable community where we eat, live, work, play, and pray. And I think you could think about it as having some key dimensions. One dimension starts with the right to recognition. Everybody has a right to be recognized in front of the law and society. I'd say important reminders in this time of immigration debates. The second is this question of distributive justice. No community should be disproportionately burdened with contaminated air, water, or other sources. And people deserve and demand access to green space, to parks, to environmental benefits. And these can be analyzed and mapped systematically and interrogated. And finally, there's a fourth dimension, which are starting to emerge more in both the scholarship and the practice of environmental justice. And it resonates with some of the theological understandings we've heard here, which is the idea of corrective justice and restorative justice. How do we correct and begin addressing the histories of unequal economic and social development over time? And how could that happen in a deeper sense of reconciliation? I couldn't resist just a couple of my own reflections. Here at a Jesuit Catholic university, I went back and dug up a couple of quotes I want to share with you before we wrap up into a wider conversation. And one starts with the 1982 commencement address at Santa Clara University by Father Ignacio Lacuria, who arrived from El Salvador, and to my mind represents part of our deep connection to Central America. He said, "There are two aspects of every university. The first and most evident is that it deals with culture, with knowledge, and the use of the intellect, the life of the mind. The second, and not so evident, is that it must be concerned with the social reality precisely because a university is inescapably a social force. The university is inescapably a social force. It must transform and enlighten the society in which it lives. This commitment to link solidarity to sustainability emerged with greater focus here at Santa Clara University 27 years later when Father Ng delivered his inaugural presidential address in 2009 and said, "Attentive to the needs we see at a Jesuit university, we set ourselves this other goal. In our ethical reflection, we consider the needs of the world. We see with increasing clarity the fragility of the planet, the depletion of the soil, the destruction of the forests, and the pollution of air and water. But probing more deeply into these issues, we learn that the poorest of the poor suffer the most, and we might ask ourselves, who hears the call? Who hears the voice of the needy? And who listens to the concerns of those in exploited lands and exploited economies? Who indeed will train the future leaders?" 6 years later, after Father Ng's inaugural address, Pope Francis directed his writings to all people of goodwill when he released one of the most, I would consider, important environmental, social, religious, and spiritual statements of our time, entitled Laudato Si', and he reminds us that the present condition of global society, where injustices abound and growing numbers of people are deprived of basic human rights and considered expendable, the principle of the common good immediately becomes logically and inevitably a call to solidarity. And so I just want to close by thinking, how do we, in a practical, next step type of way, begin to construct that solidarity together? And we've been having, through our dialogue in the Bannon Institute, as well over these last couple of days, reaching out and realizing other Jesuit and many other universities around the country and around the world, as Pedro frequently reminds us, this is not a US concern or even a North American concern. This is a global concern. And there are close to, 190 institutes of higher education that are linked to the Jesuits, and many more if we consider high schools and beyond. And so the question is, how can we act together? And we took it upon ourselves to visit many other universities, learn from their conferences, and think about some specific ideas. One is mapping our networks collectively in more detail, understanding what's happening where, and then developing a strategic plan that would have to start with this Ignatian-inspired discernment process, but with the evidence of the mapping. And two would be looking for opportunities to link environmental justice and sustainability in specific places. There are certain focal areas, or many of us find overlapping work and interest. and possibly hosting a larger conference, bringing these networks together in the coming year. So I'll end it with that, and I'd like to offer everybody a chance to dialogue with Pedro more. Thank you.
Okay. I hope that has given you a little time to find some of your own questions and thoughts. Anybody want to? I was just reminded of something there. Anyone want to raise a question there or a comment? No, I don't have it there, do I? Yes, I do. If something can stabilize. Sit. There we are. I just wanted to put that up in reference to what you were saying. It's part of the same comment that you will hear from communities here in Standing Rock and elsewhere. Okay, yes, thank you.
I was taken with your question.
Microphone is coming because all of this is being documented.
I was taken with your question, at what point does enoughness become sustainable? And is that necessarily a spiritual question? Is there?
It's an integral question.
Yeah. So I would just like to hear a little bit, I'm
Yeah.
trying to figure that out for myself.
I think everybody has a different sense of what simplicity is. I think if we stop, we all actually want something of a simpler life. Life has become very complicated. Yeah? Now, there are different levels at which we feel easier. And it's not a matter of, someone doesn't ride a bicycle or does ride a bicycle, someone eats too much meat, or someone, we've all got to find our own level, which is both an internal matter of listening to your body, of listening to others, whether it's within the family or the community, and saying, okay, for the moment, this is where I'm comfortable with these different externalities that I've got to find an internal balance with. And it changes also over time. I mean, what your commitment today as students and going out to be young professionals is, and what it's going to be once you establish a family, that's where the world turns 360. Some of you have been turning 180 degrees in class projects, but it comes 360 by the time you are looking after a family. But again, there's a level of simplicity there, enoughness as I call it. And do I take a measure of that as I go along? Not to be critical, but actually to be comfortable and to say, yeah, this is enough for me to work with. And this is how I find a balance. And then I can share that more easily with others. Not in a self-justifying way, but in an openness and a freedom. I think this sense of freedom in it, that I am a free person and that I am also mortal. Don't wait until you get to 70 or 80 or 90 to understand that you're mortal. It helps us as we go along in life. Is it on? Yes?
I was struck by, as you painted the picture of the impossible challenge, that you posed it as a trigger to forcing you to go within, challenging you to find your own resources, your own creativity as a response. But that can also be a very scary challenge in terms of, well, what if there isn't anything in there? So what's your experience and recommendation on how you deal with that personal challenge of finding your own resources to respond to this impossible challenge?
Well, when you go within, at a certain point, it's not your resources. It becomes a question of poverty. I don't have it within me. I am not invincible. Yeah, that's something, for some people, that's difficult to deal with. Others reach it very fast and then collapse under it. Yeah? So the secret is actually just to allow your nerve endings stay out there in the world like an octopus. Yeah? And actually you feel that there is care, that there are other things that you sense and that you feel and that you need to stay in contact with. And one of it is the humble realization of life itself, that I don't own my life. If you can get to that sense, then you're transforming. And then you feel in that the freedom. So you don't live by others' judgments. The trouble is we are tormented today by other people's judgments of us, or what they will think, or I'm not able to keep up with the group that I want to belong. Hang on, maybe that is not your group, and you're wasting your time and your effort with them, and you find a sense of care. When I was asking some students in Germany the other week during the Bonn meeting, I said, you know, what's your community going to be in the future? And he said he didn't know. I said, what do you want from community? And we'd gone through something of a reflection, and took him a little time, and he said, if the community would care for me in the ways that I care for community, that's probably, yeah, a good reflection back. It's working with who you are, but can community also care for me? That's somebody who's really turning the wheels internally and seeking a balance. So I think we find a poverty within, but a desire. Yeah? And my problem is if we leave this too long, people either drop out or burn out. The energy is not ours, ultimately. Whether you want to deal with that in terms of human spirit or in terms of an Ignatian interpretation of it, whatever way. Yeah? But there is integrity to be found there. If we have that integrity, then integrity with creation, integral ecology, is not a problem. This is where it all opens. Then it becomes a challenge, not based on power. I mean, my life, sorry, as a Jesuit, it's taken me a long time to stand here, is basically failure. Yeah? I have done nothing. Yeah? In terms of what accounts. I mean, you know, my superior, my boss tells me, yes, Pedro, what you're doing is great, but actually it's not reproducible. Yeah? You have no financial balance there. I have no endowment to carry on with the schools that you're working with or anything else. But I said that it is enough. That people have shared in this and have the vision to go forward themselves is enough. And I feel that's what we need in today's generation 2030, 2050. Did I see a hand there at the back?
I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how we can reconcile or integrate this process of internal discernment, which you said needs to come first, with hearing the voices of the poor and marginalized, which is so important to the procedural justice part of environmental justice. Because my concern sometimes is that if we go inward without having listened to the cry of the poor, we're going to reproduce the same deafness.
Yeah. No, I would agree with you in that. And my basic response on that is actually we never turn inward until we meet a problem outward. Yeah. It's just when we're going on and we're questioning what's really happening in life, what's really happening to me, as I see others, that if the world is an experience of success from me, I will continue going, probably. Yeah? But somewhere, I'm going to meet the imperfect, I'm going to face the reality of others and say, wow, this changes me. How do I manage? And that's where the examine, the internal reflection, and then the discernment. And the challenge is to do discernment with others. Ignatian spirituality, for me, is simply a spirituality of making a decision. Yeah? It brings us to a point of decision. There is no going back. Yeah? And that's precisely because of an experience and engagement with others by which you are forced to view the world as different. And you are forced to share the world in a way you haven't understood before. And that's why I run a number of workshops on Laudato Si. It's spirituality for action. I never close the door. The door is open and we've got to go out. Now, how we get together in order to go out together, that's what's crucial. Because if we all go off our own way and go back into our corners, we're not going to advance. Okay?
Thank you so much, Father Walpole. Particularly that I think that ethics of enoughness that you are raising, John, will continue to turn in me. So I'm grateful for your insight and prompt towards that reflection and action. A couple announcements. One is evaluations. You received when you came in a little half sheet of paper. So if you could give us your feedback as we develop future Bannon Institutes, it's really very helpful for us. Two, tomorrow over lunch, the faculty collaborative that Chris Bacon was referencing, the Bannon Institute Collaborative on Environmental Justice and the Common Good, is hosting a roundtable dialogue in Nobili Dining Room from 12 to 1:15 tomorrow over lunch, and Pedro will be responding to the collaborative, particularly looking at these university community partnerships for environmental justice and social change. So we hope that you can join us then. Also, check out our podcast, the Bannon Institute Podcast Integral. So all the members of this collaborative are featured in our 4th season on environmental justice and the common good. So you can catch those about 20-minute length episodes from our website or iTunes, SoundCloud, anywhere where you get your podcasts. And finally, you're all invited to a small reception outside these doors to continue conversation with one another, with Pedro, with our respondents, and our collaborative members. So we hope that you can join us for that. But for now, thank you all for coming, and I ask you to help me thank our distinguished lecturer and our respondents once more for their contributions. Okay.